The night train. When I boarded the night train, it didn't seem like anything special. I was just travelling to a neighbouring city for some work, and as usual, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was evening, and a quiet stillness filled the air, broken only by the faint hum of the train's wheels and the occasional flash of lights as the train passed through villages. I found my seat in a half-empty carriage. There weren't many people, as is often the case on night trains, and most passengers had already settled in, stretching their legs and closing their eyes, drifting off to sleep. I too closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest before arriving at the city, not feeling particularly tired. At first, I just felt the rhythm of the train. It was calming. But soon, as it often happens, I fell into a deep sleep. My thoughts began to fade, and the world around me dissolved into darkness. And then, when I woke up, something was already wrong. I opened my eyes and saw that the carriage was completely empty. I was surprised, thinking that maybe all the passengers had gotten off at some intermediate stop, but when I looked around, I realized everything seemed strange. The lights in the carriage were dim, as if they weren't working properly. The walls of the train appeared worn, aged. There was an unsettling feeling in the air, as if I had ended up in some forgotten, abandoned place, though just moments ago I had been traveling through perfectly lively stations. I stood up and tried to find the conductor to ask when we'd arrive. But the further I walked through the train, the stranger each carriage became. They were eerily empty. Some of them looked as if no one had sat in them for years, and the space between the seats was covered in dust and cobwebs. I entered one of the compartments and found that the walls had no windows or doors, only fragments of dark hallways. I decided to check my phone for signal, but it was futile. The phone showed no service, the screen dead, despite the fact that cell networks usually worked fine at other stations. Panic began to creep into my mind. How could I have ended up in this place? Where were all the people? Why did the train keep moving? And why didn't I know where I was or how much longer the journey would take? Suddenly, the train began to slow down, and I finally realized we were approaching a station. I approached the window, but even from there, I couldn't make out anything that could help me. The world outside the glass was covered in a strange fog, and I couldn't understand why the station looked as if time had stopped. The train doors opened abruptly. I stood up and decided to step outside. I didn't know what awaited me, but something told me it was better to get out. Everything around me looked like a scene from a horror film. Fog, crumbling buildings, empty streets. The station was completely deserted, and I realized that this place was completely dead. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had arrived in the city I had planned to visit, but now it was nothing like the one I knew. There were no people, no cars. It was as if life had vanished, dissolved into nothing. I stepped into the station building, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening, but everything inside was terrifyingly empty. There was something wet on the floor, like a puddle, and the air was filled with a foul smell of decay. I moved closer and noticed bloodstains on the walls, and then my gaze locked onto something that couldn't be real. On the blood-stained wall, there were marks leading somewhere deeper into the building. I tried to imagine what could have happened here, but the more I thought, the less I understood. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. At first, they were barely audible, but then they grew louder. I turned around and froze as something appeared in one of the hallways. Someone, or rather, something. It wasn't human. The creature, moving toward me, was twisted and distorted, like something that had once been human but had now become a grotesque parody of itself. Its skin was pale, deformed, and its eyes, deep and hollow, followed me. It was a monster, a mutant, and it was coming for me. I didn't waste any time. I turned and ran, trying to find shelter. The creature followed me, its footsteps echoing louder and louder. I dashed into a restroom, locked the door behind me, and waited, feeling the cold sweat on my skin. Inside, there was silence, except for the sound of my own breathing. Hours passed, and I didn't dare to leave. The creature continued scraping at the walls, its breathing echoing outside the door. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard something change outside the restroom. I cautiously peered out through the small window and saw that another train was now parked at the station. I didn't know where it had come from, but I had no choice. I needed to get out of here. I ran from the restroom, not thinking about the fear, and without looking back, I sprinted toward the train. The creature noticed me and started chasing after me. Its growl reverberated throughout the station, but I managed to leap aboard the train just in time. As soon as I slammed the door shut, the train started moving, and I felt a slight relief with every passing mile. A few hours later, the train stopped, and I cautiously stepped off. The place where I found myself was no longer a ghost town as it had been before. People were walking down the streets, cars were driving by, and the world was alive again, just like it used to be. I didn't know what had happened. Was it a dream? A psychotic break? Or had I somehow ended up in another time, another place? But one thing was certain. I would never forget that night on the train.
The hour glitches. That day was unusually hot for early September. I always liked traveling by train, especially when it meant visiting my grandmother, who lived in the countryside. Her old house, with its scent of wood smoke and the melancholy of time standing still, had always been a place of comfort for me. Today, I was going to spend a few days there, forget about the hustle of the city and the endless worries. I bought a ticket and boarded the train, full of anticipation. The weather was clear, and I thought this journey would be just another ordinary trip. For the first while, everything went as usual. I sat by the window, watching the fields and forests rush by, while the train rocked me in its steady rhythm. Small villages with crooked fences, children playing on the roadside, and tired farmers passed in front of my eyes. Time flew by quickly. I thought about my grandmother, whom I hadn't seen in months. Soon I felt the need to use the restroom. The trip to the bathroom was uneventful. I walked down the train car without noticing anything unusual. Passengers were sitting in their seats, reading books, chatting, or simply staring out the window. When I returned to my car, something felt off. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The lights in the car were dim, as if night had already fallen. But when I looked at the clock, I saw that it was 3 a.m. I was certain it had only been around 3 p.m. not long ago. My thoughts began to spiral, and I struggled to make sense of what was happening. I turned to the person sitting across from me and opened my mouth to ask something. But when I looked at his face, he didn't pay me any attention. I repeated my question, but his eyes were empty, like two mirrors reflecting nothing alive. I flinched, gripping the armrests of my seat, trying to make sense of what was going on. I turned to other passengers. Everyone was seated, but no one was looking at me. It was as if they weren't just preoccupied with their own business. They were in another world entirely. I stood up, trying to move to the next car, but it felt like something was preventing me. As I walked, the train seemed to grow darker. The lights began to flicker, and in that dim light, the faces of the people around me began to distort. Their faces stretched, changed, and their eyes turned black, like bottomless pits. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Fear gripped me tightly. I looked around again, and then I realized I wasn't alone. Someone was behind me. At first, I only heard footsteps, quiet, ominous, like someone was trailing behind me without making any unnecessary movements. I ran. At first, slowly, cautiously, but with each step, the fear gripped me harder. I ran into the next car, frantically searching for some way out. But it was all in vain. The footsteps grew louder, following me relentlessly with cold, mechanical precision. I stopped and looked back. There were many of them. These strange people, their faces twisted with horror and malice, moved towards me, slowly but in a synchrony that felt almost supernatural. They weren't alive in the way I understood it. They were like puppets whose strings were pulled by some otherworldly force. I tried to scream, but my voice seemed to fall on deaf ears. All I could hear was a terrible, incomprehensible hum. Everything around me began to move in unnatural ways, like in some twisted nightmare. I kept running. I leapt over seats, crawled from one car to the next, but they kept coming after me. With each passing second, their presence became more suffocating. At one point, I lost all sense of time. It felt like I had been running forever. And when I looked at my reflection in one of the train's windows, I saw something that made my blood freeze. I couldn't tell who it was. Was it me? Was I seeing myself, or had I become one of them, lost in their nightmare world? I glanced around and saw one of them, already close behind. He grabbed my arm, cold, rigid, like stone. His eyes were empty voids, and I felt myself being pulled into them. I tried to break free, but his grip was too strong. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and I realized he had caught me. My legs buckled. I tried to remember something, anything, about my grandmother, my home, what was supposed to be. But then that fear gripped me again, the kind of terror I felt in that moment. My body refused to obey, and everything around me blurred. The faces of the passengers mixed into an unrecognizable mass. I didn't know what would happen to me next. And then I woke up. I woke up with a terrible feeling, as if I had just lived through a nightmare. The train was stopped at the station, and I heard the familiar sound of wheels clattering as someone got off at the platform. Sunlight streamed through the window. I wiped the sweat from my brow. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. I had arrived.
Shadows at the station. The night on the train was thick and inexplicable. Everything around me, that same kind of darkness that fills empty carriages where the sounds of whistles and conversations are no more. That moment when the train, seemingly following its usual route, makes you intuitively feel that something's wrong. I was sitting by the window, staring out at the endless landscape beyond the glass. The night was dark, with only the lazy moon rising in the sky, like something ominous and quiet, shedding a weak light over the empty earth. The carriage was nearly empty, a few passengers, each lost in their own thoughts, some asleep, others just sitting, immersed in silence. Only occasional coughs or the rhythmic clatter of the wheels broke the stillness. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 1 a.m. Everything felt strange, but I didn't know exactly why. At first, I noticed it through the window. Ahead, in the mist, something appeared. I thought it was just the distant lights of a village or a station, but the closer we got, the clearer it became that it shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the lights went out, and in their place there was only shadow. Unusual, strange, as if it had no form. I felt uneasy, a tightening in my chest. I tried to distract myself by turning to a book, but it didn't help. Thoughts kept creeping into my mind. What was that? Where are we? Why wasn't the train stopping at the usual station? I stood up, walked toward the front where the conductor sat, but his face was obscured behind the glass of the front cabin, and he didn't say a word. Strange, I thought, but I didn't pay it much attention. I tried to go back to my seat, but suddenly the train slowed down. It was odd. We weren't supposed to stop here. And then everything in the train went completely silent. No announcements, no engine sounds, just quiet. Suddenly the train came to a complete stop. A deep, eerie silence filled the carriage. The same darkness crept in. I listened. The train seemed frozen. I got up, walked over to the window, pressing my face against the glass, trying to see what was going on. In the distance, through the darkened windows, I saw a platform, and nothing else. No people, no lights, just emptiness. Then, unexpectedly, with a mix of confusion and strange dread, I noticed that the doors of the carriage were open. The darkness rushed in from outside, only faint hints of light like reflections in water. I gathered my courage and decided to step outside. There was no movement beyond the doors, just fog and an endless void. I didn't know why, but something pulled me forward. Something made me feel like I was expected here. I wasn't afraid. Maybe because I was in the train where nothing could go wrong, right? Well, not in the real world. I took a few steps onto the platform. The buildings around me seemed unnaturally tall and dark. Nothing special about them, just abandoned. Yet something felt wrong. They were old, very old, as though they hadn't seen people in years. Only a few dim windows flickered faintly, as if candles that once burned had long since gone out. I approached the building, glancing at its cracked brick wall. It looked like a forgotten place. Everything around seemed somewhat nonsensical. The wind had stopped, and instead of the usual noise, there was only silence. I slowed my steps. And then, as I was near the door, I heard a voice from inside. "Don't come in." I froze, my heart beating faster. The voice was faint, strange, and not human. Inside me, something warned me that I shouldn't go in, but something else urged me to do it. Despite the growing sense of unease, I stepped forward. The building was dark, the air inside thick and stale, like it hadn't been touched in ages. I entered the dark corridor, the cold penetrating my skin, and with each step I took, it felt like time itself had stopped. And then I saw something strange. Old suitcases lying on the floor, worn with age. But there was something even stranger. All the suitcases were open, and inside there was nothing but dust. I approached one of them, trying to understand what kind of place this was. But as soon as I touched the suitcase, it felt like someone was watching me. I quickly turned around. Nothing. It was empty, just the silence. And then the voice whispered again, barely audible, "You shouldn't be here." My heart clenched with fear, and I felt cold fingers brush against my skin. I turned around, but there was no one, just empty space, the silence. And then, once again, the voice, "Leave now." I ran for the exit, but the door slammed shut right in front of me. I spun around, and at that moment, the windows began to flicker, as if something inside was trying to break free. I tried to escape, but the door wouldn't open. Suddenly, eyes appeared outside. They weren't human eyes. They were empty, dark, lifeless, reflecting only my own face. I felt the walls begin to close in around me, and it suddenly dawned on me. There was no time here. The walls were moving. This train, this station, this moment, it had all frozen, and I was left here, like no one else, forever. I bolted to the platform, but the train was gone. Everything disappeared. I was standing alone in the dead silence. No road, no way out. Time had stopped. The train was gone. I was left alone in this hell.